Hey everyone, welcome back to another peaceful bedtime story that's perfect for the whole family. Tonight we're diving into something truly special, a love story that spans decades and proves that true love never really dies. It's the tale of Captain America and Peggy Carter, two souls who found each other in the chaos of war and whose connection transcended time itself. So get comfortable, pull up those blankets, and let me take you on a journey through one of the most beautiful romances ever told. Before we begin, I want you to close your eyes and imagine a world where heroes weren't just born from comic books, but from the hearts of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things. This is a story about courage, about sacrifice, and most importantly, about a love so pure that it could wait 70 years for its perfect moment. Whether you're 8 or 80, this tale will remind you that some connections are simply meant to be. Tonight's story starts in Brooklyn, New York, in the year 1943. The world was at war, and hope seemed as fragile as morning frost. But sometimes, in the darkest of times, the brightest lights begin to shine. This is where we meet Steve Rogers, a young man with a heart bigger than his small frame could contain. Steve wasn't the strongest or the fastest or the tallest, but he had something that couldn't be measured by any scale. He had an unshakable belief that good would always triumph over evil, and that every person, no matter how small, deserved to be protected. Steve lived in a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, but he never complained. He spent his days trying to enlist in the army, and his evenings sketching in a worn leather journal that had belonged to his mother. He drew pictures of the Brooklyn Bridge, of children playing in the park, of his best friend, Bucky Barnes, laughing at one of his own jokes. But most often, he drew scenes of peace, imagining a world where families could gather around dinner tables without fear, where children could play in streets without worry, where love could bloom without the shadow of war hanging overhead. Every morning, Steve would walk to the recruitment office with hope in his chest and determination in his step. And every afternoon, he would walk home with a rejection slip in his pocket, but never with defeat in his heart. The doctors always said the same thing: too small, too weak, too many health problems. But Steve knew something they didn't. He knew that strength wasn't just about muscles, and courage wasn't just about size. Meanwhile, across the ocean in London, England, there was a woman named Margaret Carter, though everyone called her Peggy. Peggy worked for a secret organization helping the war effort, and she was absolutely brilliant at it. She could decode messages that left other agents scratching their heads. She could plan missions that seemed impossible, and she could inspire confidence in soldiers who had forgotten what hope looked like. Peggy had dark hair that she always wore perfectly styled, even in the middle of air raid sirens, and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. But Peggy Carter was more than just smart and capable. She was kind in a way that made wounded soldiers smile, brave in a way that made grown men feel safe, and funny in a way that could make even the most serious generals chuckle despite themselves. She believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. And she never, ever gave up on people, even when they had given up on themselves. One particularly gray London morning, Peggy was walking through the halls of her office building when she received a telegram that would change everything. A secret project in America was looking for the right kind of person to help with something important, something that could help end the war, and save countless lives. They needed someone smart, someone trustworthy, someone who understood that some secrets were worth keeping. Peggy read the message 3 times, packed her bags that very afternoon, and boarded a ship bound for New York City. She had no idea that halfway across the world, Steve Rogers was about to have his own life-changing moment. It happened on a Tuesday evening, when Steve was walking home from yet another rejection. He heard shouting from an alley and saw a group of men picking on someone smaller than themselves. Steve never could walk away from a fight when someone needed help, even though he usually ended up needing help himself. But that night, something magical happened. A kind scientist named Dr. Erskine had been watching Steve, not just that evening, but for weeks. He had seen Steve get knocked down and get back up. He had seen Steve stand up for others, even when he couldn't stand up for himself. And Dr. Erskine realized that Steve Rogers had exactly what the secret project needed. Not muscles or speed or size, but heart. Pure, unbreakable heart. The next morning, Dr. Erskine approached Steve with an opportunity that sounded too good to be true. A chance to serve his country, a chance to make a real difference, a chance to become the soldier he had always dreamed of being. Steve didn't hesitate for even a second. He said yes before Dr. Erskine had finished explaining, because Steve Rogers had been waiting his whole life for the chance to help others. And he wasn't about to let that chance slip away. And that's how Steve Rogers found himself on a train heading to a secret military base, clutching a letter from Dr. Erskine and wondering what adventures awaited him. He watched the countryside roll past his window and sketched scenes of farms and forests and small towns where people were living their lives, working and laughing and loving, trusting that someone somewhere was fighting to keep them safe. The secret base was unlike anything Steve had ever seen. There were scientists in white coats hurrying between buildings, soldiers training with equipment he didn't recognize, and an air of excitement and secrecy that made everything feel important and mysterious. Steve was given a small room with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the training grounds, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. On his first morning at the base, Steve woke up before dawn and made his way to the mess hall for breakfast. He was nervous about meeting the other recruits, wondering if they would accept him or if they would see what everyone else saw, a small man trying to be something he wasn't. But as he walked through the doors of the mess hall, something incredible happened. Standing near the coffee station, reviewing papers with a serious expression, was the most beautiful woman Steve had ever seen. She had dark hair pinned back in victory rolls, a crisp uniform that showed she meant business, and an air of confidence that made everyone around her stand a little straighter. When she looked up from her papers and their eyes met across the room, Steve felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening in a house he had thought was empty. This was Agent Margaret Carter, though Steve wouldn't learn her name for several more minutes. Peggy had arrived at the base 3 days earlier and was already making improvements to training protocols and mission strategies. She had a way of seeing solutions where others saw problems, and she had impressed every commanding officer she had met. But when she looked across that mess hall and saw a young man with kind eyes and a nervous smile holding his breakfast tray, like he wasn't sure where he belonged, something shifted in her chest, too. Steve managed to walk across the room without tripping, which he considered a small miracle, and introduced himself with a handshake that was firmer than his confidence felt. Peggy introduced herself in return, and when she smiled, Steve thought that maybe, just maybe, the sun had decided to rise twice that morning. They talked for exactly 11 minutes before the morning training whistle blew. But in those 11 minutes, something beautiful began to grow. Their first conversation was about coffee, of all things. Steve mentioned that the coffee at the base was stronger than anything he had ever tasted. And Peggy laughed and said that was because it was designed to wake up soldiers, not put them to sleep. She told him that back in London, she had learned to make tea so strong it could wake the dead. But she was still learning to appreciate American coffee culture. Steve said he would be happy to show her the best coffee shops in Brooklyn someday, if they ever made it back to New York together. And just like that, without either of them quite realizing it, they had made their first plan for the future. A simple coffee date in Brooklyn. Nothing fancy or complicated. Just two people sharing a warm drink and getting to know each other better. It was the kind of plan that seemed small in the moment, but would grow into something much larger. Something that would sustain them through the darkest days ahead. From that morning forward, Steve and Peggy found excuses to be near each other. Steve would volunteer for extra training sessions that Peggy was supervising. Peggy would happen to be reviewing files in the library when Steve was studying there. They would sit together at meals and talk about books and movies and their dreams for what the world might look like when the war was over. Steve learned that Peggy had grown up with two brothers who taught her to throw a punch and hold her own in any argument. Peggy learned that Steve had lost both his parents young, but had never lost his faith in people's basic goodness. They discovered they both loved dancing, though neither had had much opportunity to practice lately, and they both believed that small acts of kindness could change the world more than grand gestures ever could. As the days passed and their friendship deepened, everyone on the base could see that something special was happening between the small soldier from Brooklyn and the brilliant agent from London. They complemented each other perfectly, Steve's gentle optimism balancing Peggy's fierce determination, her worldly confidence giving him strength, his unwavering moral compass helping her remember why they were fighting in the first place. But their love story was just beginning, and neither of them knew that their greatest adventures and their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The transformation began 3 weeks after Steve and Peggy first met. Dr. Erskine had been watching Steve carefully, noting not just his physical capabilities, but his character, his choices, the way he treated others when he thought no one was looking. And what the good doctor saw convinced him that Steve Rogers was exactly the right person for the most important experiment of the war. On a crisp autumn morning, Steve was called to a special laboratory hidden deep beneath the main building. The room was filled with strange machines and glowing lights, and scientists in white coats moved about with the kind of focused energy that suggested something momentous was about to happen. In the center of it all stood a chair that looked like it belonged in a science fiction story, surrounded by panels covered in buttons, in switches, in displays, showing numbers that meant nothing to Steve, but everything to the people operating them. Dr. Erskine explained that they had developed a serum, a special formula that could enhance human capabilities. It wasn't magic, he was careful to explain, but science. The serum would make Steve stronger and faster, but more importantly, it would amplify who he already was inside. A good man would become better, a bad man would become worse. That's why the choice of test subject was so crucial, and why Dr. Erskine had chosen Steve. Peggy stood in the observation booth above the laboratory, her hands pressed against the glass as she watched Steve settle into the chair. She had tried to talk to him before the procedure, to tell him to be careful, to come back safely. but the words had gotten tangled up in her throat. Instead, she had squeezed his hand and told him she would see him on the other side. And Steve had smiled that brave, nervous smile that made her heart do small somersaults. The procedure itself was like watching lightning captured in a bottle. Lights flashed, machines hummed with power, and Steve's face showed the strain of something incredible happening inside his body. When the energy finally faded and the machines powered down, everyone in the room held their breath. The chair was surrounded by steam and smoke, and for a terrifying moment, Peggy couldn't see if Steve was all right. Then the smoke cleared, and Steve Rogers stepped out of that chair, transformed. He was taller now, broader through the shoulders, with muscles that looked like they had been carved from marble. But when he looked up at the observation booth and found Peggy's eyes, his smile was exactly the same. The same kindness, the same warmth, the same gentle soul that had made her fall in love with him in the first place, just wrapped in a package that could finally match the size of his heart. The first thing Steve did after the medical team finished their examinations was find Peggy. She was waiting for him in the hallway outside the laboratory, trying to look professional and composed, but failing to hide the relief and joy in her eyes. When he approached her, she reached out and touched his arm, as if she needed to convince herself that he was real and whole and still himself. They talked for hours that night, walking through the quiet corridors of the base while everyone else slept. Steve told her how strange it felt to look down and see muscles where there had been none before, to take a step and cover twice the distance he expected. But he also told her that the most important things hadn't changed at all. He still wanted to help people. He still believed in doing the right thing. And he still got nervous when she smiled at him in that particular way that made him forget whatever he had been about to say. Peggy told him that she had been frightened during the procedure, more frightened than she had ever been during air raids or dangerous missions. She had realized, watching him in that chair, that somewhere along the way, he had become essential to her world, not just as a friend or a colleague, but as something deeper, something that didn't have a name in the military handbook, but felt as real as gravity. With Steve's transformation came new responsibilities and new dangers. He was given a shield, a perfect circle of metal that seemed to weigh nothing in his hands, but could stop bullets and deflect explosions. He was given a uniform in red, white, and blue, with a star on the chest that symbolized hope for everyone who saw it. And he was given a new name, Captain America, the living symbol of everything the country stood for, everything worth fighting to protect. But even as Steve Rogers became Captain America, he never forgot the small moments that mattered most. He still sketched in his journal every evening, though now he drew pictures of Peggy more often than anything else. Her laugh, her profile when she was concentrating on a difficult problem, her hands as she gestured while explaining a strategy. He filled page after page with memories of her, as if he could keep her safe by capturing her in pencil and paper. Peggy, meanwhile, found herself becoming Steve's closest advisor and most trusted friend. She helped plan his missions, briefed him on enemy positions, and waited in the communications room during every operation, listening to radio chatter and praying to hear his voice check in safely. She learned to read the tension in his shoulders when he was worried about civilians, the set of his jaw when he was angry about injustice, the way his whole face softened when he talked about the future they might have together when the war was over. Their relationship deepened through shared purpose and mutual respect. They worked together like two parts of the same machine. Steve's courage and strength, perfectly complemented by Peggy's intelligence and strategic mind. In the briefing room, they could communicate with just a glance. On the battlefield, they moved together like dancers who had rehearsed the same routine for years. And in the quiet moments between missions, they talked about everything and nothing, building a foundation of understanding that felt solid enough to last forever. One evening, after a particularly difficult mission that had lasted 3 days and ended with the rescue of 24 prisoners of war, Steve and Peggy found themselves alone in the base's small garden. It wasn't much of a garden, really, just a few flower beds and a bench that someone had placed beneath an old oak tree. But in the moonlight, with the sounds of war feeling far away for once, it seemed like the most beautiful place in the world. They sat on the bench together, close enough that Peggy could feel the warmth radiating from Steve's body, close enough that Steve could catch the subtle scent of her perfume mixed with the evening air. They talked about the mission, about the families who would be reunited because of their work, about the letters they would write to the families of soldiers who wouldn't be coming home. But eventually, their conversation turned to more personal things. Steve told Peggy about his childhood in Brooklyn, about the way his mother used to sing while she cooked dinner, about the summers he spent reading library books on the fire escape because their apartment was too hot. Peggy told Steve about growing up in London, about her father teaching her to drive when she was barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel, about the way her whole family would gather around the radio on Sunday evenings to listen to music together. They discovered they both missed simple things most of all: the sound of church bells on Sunday morning, the smell of bread baking in neighborhood shops, the laughter of children playing games in the street. They talked about the world they were fighting to preserve. Not the grand political concepts, but the small, human moments that made life worth living. As the night grew later and the air grew cooler, Steve did something that surprised them both. He reached over and took Peggy's hand in his, not romantically or possessively, but gently, like he was offering comfort and asking for it at the same time. Her hand fit perfectly in his, despite the changes the serum had made to his size, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the distant sounds of the base settling down for the night. That was the moment when they both knew, without saying a word, that what they felt for each other was more than friendship, more than professional respect, more than the bonds forged by shared danger. It was love, pure and simple and complicated and beautiful, the kind of love that makes everything else make sense, that gives meaning to sacrifice and purpose to courage. But even as they acknowledged their feelings, they both understood the challenges ahead. Steve's missions were becoming more dangerous as his reputation grew. Peggy's work was taking her into increasingly risky situations. They were living in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, where people said goodbye in the morning and never saw each other again. Their love would have to be strong enough to survive uncertainty, patient enough to wait for peace, and brave enough to hope for a future that seemed impossibly far away. The next morning brought new orders and new missions, but it also brought a new understanding between them. They didn't need grand declarations or dramatic gestures. They had something better. They had trust, respect, shared purpose, and the quiet certainty that whatever happened, they would face it together. Their love story was just beginning to unfold, and the most beautiful chapters were yet to be written. Their first dance happened entirely by accident. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. and most of the base had gathered in the main hall for what the commanding officers optimistically called a morale event. Someone had managed to procure a record player and a small collection of albums, and the idea was that a little music might help everyone forget, just for a few hours, that they were in the middle of a war. Steve had been standing near the wall, watching other couples move across the makeshift dance floor with a mixture of admiration and nervousness. He had always loved music, but dancing was something he had only dreamed about. Back in Brooklyn, he had been too small and too shy to ask anyone to dance. And besides, most of the girls he knew were already dancing with boys who looked like they belonged on a dance floor. Peggy had been reviewing mission reports at a table in the corner, but she kept finding herself distracted by the music. There was something about the gentle melodies that reminded her of happier times, of family gatherings and celebrations that felt like they belonged to a different world. She watched the dancers with a wistful expression, remembering the lessons her mother had given her in their London parlor, stepping carefully around the furniture while her father played piano. The song that changed everything was a slow, sweet melody about moonlight and promises. Steve had been working up the courage to approach Peggy for nearly 20 minutes when the opening notes began to play. Something about the music gave him the bravery he needed, and he found himself walking across the room before his nervous mind could convince him to turn back. He appeared at her table like a nervous schoolboy, his hands clasped behind his back and a hopeful expression on his face. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of the Brooklyn accent that became stronger when he was anxious. "I was wondering if you might like to dance. I should warn you, though, I'm not very good at it. Actually, I've never really done it before. But the music is nice, and I thought maybe we could figure it out together." Peggy looked up at him with surprise that quickly melted into the warmest smile he had ever seen. She closed her reports, set down her pen, and stood up with the kind of graceful confidence that made everything look easy. "I would love to dance, Captain," she said, and when she took his offered hand, Steve felt like he had just won the most important battle of his life. They made their way to the edge of the dance floor, both of them suddenly aware that other people might be watching, both of them trying not to care. Steve placed his hand carefully on Peggy's waist, as if she were made of something precious that might break if he held too tightly. Peggy placed her hand on his shoulder and smiled up at him with an expression that said everything would be all right. For the first few steps, they were both concentrating so hard on not stepping on each other's feet that they forgot to actually listen to the music. Steve was thinking about where to put his hands. Peggy was thinking about the proper distance to maintain, and both of them were trying to remember everything they had ever heard about dancing. But then, something magical happened. The music seemed to take over, and suddenly, they weren't thinking anymore. They were just moving together, slowly and carefully, finding a rhythm that belonged entirely to them. Steve discovered that dancing with Peggy was like having a conversation without words. When he moved slightly to the left, she followed effortlessly. When she stepped back, he stepped forward at exactly the right moment. They weren't performing for anyone else or trying to impress the other couples on the floor. They were simply enjoying the feeling of moving together, of being close enough to talk quietly while the music played around them. As they swayed to the gentle melody, they talked about everything and nothing. Peggy told Steve about the dance lessons her governess had insisted upon when she was 12, how she had complained about them at the time, but now felt grateful for every awkward afternoon spent learning to waltz in her family's drawing room. Steve told Peggy about watching couples dance at neighborhood festivals in Brooklyn, how he had always imagined what it might feel like to hold someone close and move to music together. The song seemed to last forever and end too quickly at the same time. When the final notes faded away, Steve and Peggy found themselves still standing close together, neither quite ready to step apart. Around them, other couples were changing partners or leaving the dance floor, but they remained in their own small world, smiling at each other with the satisfaction of people who had just shared something perfectly simple and perfectly wonderful. From that night forward, dancing became their special tradition. Whenever the bass held social events, whenever someone managed to find music, whenever they had a few minutes alone and could hum a melody together, they would dance. Not because they were particularly good at it, but because those moments of closeness and music and gentle movement became a way of saying things they couldn't put into words. They developed their own style over the weeks that followed. Steve learned to lead with confidence, but never possessiveness, always making sure Peggy had space to add her own flair to their movements. Peggy learned to follow his lead while still maintaining her own independence, creating a partnership that felt equal and natural. They invented little variations that belonged only to them, small flourishes and turns that made their dancing unique during particularly difficult weeks, when missions went badly, or when the weight of the war felt too heavy to bear. They would find a quiet corner somewhere and dance to imaginary music. Peggy would hum softly while Steve held her close, or Steve would whisper the words to songs his mother used to sing while Peggy rested her head against his shoulder. These private dances became their way of healing, their way of remembering that beauty and tenderness could still exist in a world full of conflict. The other soldiers and agents on the base began to recognize these dancing moments as something sacred. When they saw Steve and Peggy moving together to music only they could hear, conversations would quiet and people would give them space, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something precious and rare. Even the commanding officers, who normally had little patience for romance during wartime, seemed to recognize that what Steve and Peggy shared made them both better at their jobs, more focused in their missions, more committed to the cause they were fighting for. One particularly memorable evening in December, a snowstorm had knocked out power to most of the base. Instead of canceling the planned social gathering, someone had gathered every candle they could find and arranged them around the main hall. The flickering light created an atmosphere that was both mysterious and romantic, like something from a fairy tale. When the music began to play, powered by a hand-cranked gramophone that someone had discovered in storage, the dancing that followed felt almost magical. Steve and Peggy danced that night with a dozen other couples, but the candlelight seemed to create a private world around them. The warm glow softened everything, making the harsh realities of military life feel far away. They moved together with the kind of easy grace that comes from practice and trust, their shadows dancing on the walls around them like echoes of their happiness. Between dances, they would step outside into the snow-covered courtyard, where the winter air was crisp and clean and full of promise. They would walk hand in hand along the shoveled pathways, talking about their childhoods, their dreams, the kind of life they might build together when the war was over. These conversations were full of gentle hopes and careful plans, the kind of future building that people do when they've found someone worth waiting for. Steve told Peggy about his dreams of returning to art, maybe teaching children to draw or painting murals in schools and community centers. He wanted to use his abilities to help people, but he also wanted to create beautiful things that would outlast the conflicts of their time. Peggy told Steve about her hopes of continuing to work in intelligence, but in peacetime, helping to build bridges between nations instead of planning military operations. They talked about traveling together, seeing the world when it was safe to do so. Steve wanted to show Peggy the Brooklyn neighborhoods where he had grown up, the libraries where he had spent countless hours reading, the parks where he had sketched and dreamed. Peggy wanted to take Steve to London, to introduce him to her family, to walk with him through the museums and galleries and historic streets that had shaped her understanding of the world. But more than anything, they talked about the simple life they might share. A home with a garden where they could grow flowers and vegetables. Sunday mornings spent reading newspapers and drinking coffee together. Evening walks through whatever neighborhood they chose to call home. The kind of ordinary, peaceful existence that seemed impossibly precious to two people who spent their days planning military operations and risking their lives for strangers. These dreams sustained them through the darkest moments of the war. When missions went wrong, when friends were lost, when the news from the front lines was discouraging, they would remember their conversations in the snow-covered courtyard and find the strength to continue. Their love had become more than just a personal connection. It had become a symbol of everything they were fighting to protect, everything they hoped to preserve for future generations. As winter melted into spring, their relationship deepened in ways that went beyond romance. They became true partners, reading each other's thoughts during briefings, anticipating each other's needs during missions, supporting each other through the inevitable difficulties that came with their dangerous work. Other people on the base began to see them as a unit, recognizing that Steve and Peggy together were more effective than either of them could be alone. But with spring came new challenges and new dangers. The war was reaching a critical phase, and both Steve and Peggy found themselves assigned to increasingly risky operations. They had learned to say goodbye with grace, to support each other's work even when it meant separation and worry. Their love had grown strong enough to survive uncertainty, patient enough to wait through long deployments, and brave enough to face whatever the future might bring. The most beautiful part of their relationship was how it remained gentle despite everything around them. In a world full of violence and conflict, they created spaces of tenderness and peace. They never took their love for granted, never assumed that tomorrow would bring another chance to be together. Every conversation, every dance, every quiet moment was treasured as the gift it truly was. Their story was becoming something larger than just two people falling in love during wartime. It was becoming a testament to the power of human connection, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, hearts could find each other and create light. And though neither of them knew it yet, their greatest test and their most profound demonstration of love still lay ahead, waiting in the dangerous skies above the Atlantic Ocean. The spring of 1945 brought news that filled everyone on the base with cautious hope. The war was turning, battles were being won, and for the first time in years, people began to speak seriously about what peace might look like. But with hope came urgency, and with urgency came the most dangerous mission of Steve's career as Captain America. Intelligence reports had revealed that enemy forces were planning one final, devastating attack using a massive aircraft loaded with experimental weapons. The plane was hidden somewhere in the frozen mountains of the North Atlantic, and once it took off, it would be nearly impossible to stop. The mission was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. find the aircraft, board it while in flight, and prevent it from reaching populated areas at any cost. Steve accepted the assignment without hesitation, as Peggy knew he would. But for the first time since they had fallen in love, she found herself struggling with the weight of what his sense of duty might cost them. They had talked about the future so many times, planned so many dreams together, that the possibility of those dreams being cut short felt almost unbearable. The night before the mission, they walked together through the base one final time. The spring air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of flowers that had somehow managed to bloom despite everything. They didn't talk much during that walk, both understanding that some moments were too precious for words. Instead, they simply enjoyed being close to each other, memorizing the feeling of walking side by side, the sound of their footsteps on the gravel paths, the way moonlight caught in Peggy's hair. They stopped at their favorite spot, the small garden with the old oak tree and the simple wooden bench. Someone had planted daffodils around the base of the tree, and even in the dim light, the yellow flowers seemed to glow with promise. Steve and Peggy sat together as they had so many times before. But tonight felt different, weighted with significance and unspoken fears. Steve pulled out his sketch journal and showed Peggy the drawings he had made over the past months. Page after page of her face, her hands, her profile when she was concentrating, pictures of them dancing together, of quiet moments in the library, of her laughing at something he had said during a briefing. He had captured their entire relationship in pencil and paper, creating a visual diary of their love story. Peggy traced the lines of his drawings with her fingertip, amazed by the detail and care he had put into each one. She could see herself through his eyes in these pictures, and what she saw was someone beautiful and strong and worthy of love. In return, she gave him something she had been saving for the right moment, a photograph of herself, taken before the war when she was visiting her family's country house. In the picture, she was sitting in a garden not unlike this one, wearing a simple dress and smiling at whoever was behind the camera. They talked about practical things that night, the kind of arrangements people make when they're not sure what tomorrow will bring. Steve made Peggy promise that if something happened to him, she would continue their work, continue fighting for the world they both believed in. Peggy made Steve promise that no matter what happened during the mission, he would remember that he was loved, that someone would be waiting for him to come home. But mostly, they talked about love itself, about what it meant to find someone who understood your heart completely, about the way love could make even the most ordinary moments feel extraordinary. They talked about how grateful they were to have found each other, even in the middle of a war, even with so much uncertainty surrounding them. As the night grew later, they made plans for what they would do when Steve returned safely. They would take that coffee date in Brooklyn that they had talked about on their first morning together. They would dance to real music in a real ballroom, not just in military halls with scratchy records. They would visit museums and galleries together, sharing their love of art and beauty. They would build the quiet, peaceful life they had dreamed about during those snowy conversations in December. Steve told Peggy that when the war was over, he wanted to marry her in a small ceremony with just their closest friends present. Nothing elaborate or formal, just a simple exchange of vows that would make their commitment official. Peggy told Steve that she wanted them to have a home with a garden where they could grow flowers together, where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the sunset while planning their next day together. These weren't just dreams anymore, they realized. They were promises, commitments they were making to each other, and to the future they would create together. The love they had built was strong enough to survive separation, patient enough to wait through danger, and real enough to base a lifetime upon. When dawn finally began to break over the base, they knew it was time to say goodbye. But this goodbye felt different from all the others they had shared. This one carried the weight of everything they meant to each other, everything they hoped for, everything they were willing to fight to protect. Steve held Peggy close as they stood beside the oak tree, both of them trying to memorize the feeling of being in each other's arms. He whispered that he loved her, that she had made him believe in happiness, that knowing her had been the greatest gift of his life. Peggy whispered back that he was her hero in ways that had nothing to do with his uniform or his shield, that his kindness and courage had changed her understanding of what love could be. They kissed goodbye as the sun rose over the mountains, a gentle kiss that tasted like promises and hope and the kind of love that could survive anything. When they finally stepped apart, both of them were crying, but they were also smiling because they knew that what they shared was too strong to be broken by distance or danger or time. Steve walked toward the aircraft that would take him to his mission, turning back once to see Peggy standing beneath the oak tree, her hand raised in farewell. She stayed there until his plane disappeared into the morning sky, then walked slowly back to the communications room where she would wait and listen and pray for news of his safe return. The mission began exactly as planned. Steve's aircraft found the enemy plane hidden in a remote mountain range, and he managed to board it during flight, fighting his way through enemy soldiers to reach the controls. But what he found there was worse than anyone had imagined. The aircraft was carrying enough experimental weapons to destroy entire cities, and it was already too close to populated areas to be safely redirected. In the communications room, Peggy listened to Steve's voice crackling through the radio as he described what he was seeing, what he was facing, what his options were. She could hear in his tone that he had already made his decision, already chosen the path that would save the most lives, even if it cost him everything. The conversation that followed would echo in Peggy's heart for the rest of her life. Steve's voice, calm and steady despite the danger, telling her that he was going to have to crash the aircraft into the ice to prevent it from reaching the cities below. Peggy's voice, trying to stay professional while her heart was breaking, giving him coordinates for the safest crash site, telling him there might still be time to find another way. But they both knew there wasn't time. There was only enough time for the most important words, the ones that would have to last forever. Steve told Peggy that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that loving her had made him understand what he was truly fighting for. Peggy told Steve that he was the bravest, kindest, most wonderful man she had ever known, that he had shown her what real love looked like. They talked about their dreams one final time, the coffee date in Brooklyn, the garden they would plant together, the quiet life they had planned. Steve promised Peggy that if there was any way to survive, any way to come back to her, he would find it. Peggy promised Steve that she would never forget him, never stop believing in the love they had shared, never stop fighting for the world he had died to protect. Their last words to each other were simple and perfect. Steve said, "I love you, Peggy. I'll find you. No matter how long it takes, no matter what I have to do, I'll find you." Peggy said, "I love you too, Steve. I'll be waiting. However long it takes, I'll be waiting." And then the radio went silent. The massive aircraft disappeared beneath the frozen waters of the North Atlantic, taking with it the most courageous man Peggy had ever known. But what Steve and Peggy didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that the ice would preserve him perfectly, keeping him safe until the world was ready for heroes again. 70 years later, when Steve Rogers opened his eyes in a world he didn't recognize, the first thing he asked about was a dance he owed to a beautiful woman named Peggy Carter. And when they finally found each other again, when Steve walked into that nursing home and saw Peggy's face light up with recognition and joy, they discovered that true love really can wait forever. Their dance had been postponed, not canceled. Their coffee date in Brooklyn had been delayed, not forgotten. Some promises, it turns out, are stronger than time itself. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that the best love stories are the ones where love finds a way to keep its promises, no matter how impossible that might seem. Sweet dreams, everyone. And may your own love stories be filled with the same courage, patience, and hope that made Steve and Peggy's romance truly timeless.